Okay, so by this point, you should be pretty comfortable with those basic Power Query and query editing tools, those number tools, those text tools, date specific tools. They're all pretty user friendly and pretty easy to operate, as I'm sure you've noticed. But there are some more interesting ones and some tools that are a little bit less intuitive to work with. And let's cover a few of those now. We're going to start with pivoting and unpivoting. And it sounds a little bit nebulous, but basically, the way I describe it is that pivoting is really just a fancy way to describe the process of turning distinct row values into their own columns. That's called pivoting, or turning columns into rows, which is called unpivoting. Now, you're probably reading this and saying, okay, I understand all those words, but it's still not quite clicking. At least that was my experience. So hopefully this visual will help. Picture this little table. We've just got one dimension and one quantitative values field. We've got year in the first column, sales in the second column. If we were to pivot that table, here's what we'd get. We would take every distinct year in the column that we've selected, and we're going to pivot those years into columns. So 1990 becomes its own column. 91 becomes its own column. And as you can see, the actual sales values from the next column, they follow, they stick with it. They're kind of getting flipped on their side, that's all. So that's what pivoting this table would look like. Now, the other direction, unpivoting, is as simple as going from horizontal to vertical. So you'd take all of those distinct columns that are selected, and it would turn those column headers into their own rows. So, little rule of thumb that has helped me kind of get a good grasp on this concept is imagine the table is kind of on a hinge, right here in the corner. Pivoting is like rotating it up from vertical to horizontal, and unpivoting is like rotating it down from horizontal to vertical. And one thing to note here, there's another tool called transpose that works in a really, really similar way, but it doesn't recognize unique values. So if you don't have uniques, then transpose often does the exact same thing as pivot or unpivot. But if you do have duplicates, those won't be rolled together. So the entire table basically just gets flipped on its side. Each row becomes a column, and each column becomes a row. So for instance, if we had 1990, 1990, 1991, and then pivoted it, the 1990 values would aggregate together because pivoting respects unique values, whereas transposing would create two columns for 1990. So that's a small difference, but important to keep in mind. Now, I actually put a little demo file together to show you this. So let me hop into Excel and show you what that looks like. Okay, so you won't have this file, so just kind of sit back and watch this one. Really quick demo. I'm going to pull up a CSV that I call my unpivot demo, and I'm going to just load this right up into the query editor. Okay, so right off the bat, you'll see a few issues with this table. For one, there's no header row that's been identified, which, it's understandable. Excel saw the sample file and it said, all right, it looks like you've just got columns with a bunch of values in it. It didn't know that the first row is actually years as a dimension as opposed to values. So we can go ahead and fix that in the home menu. Use first row as headers, which just promotes that first row. And now we've got a column for each year and a row for each measure or metric, unit sales and total revenue. So that's the first issue with the table. The second is that it's just in a really inconvenient format. And I run into this all the time. A lot of times people share data in a way like this where they're trying to be helpful and break things out for you. One thing that I commonly see is something like breaking out each month of data into its own tab in Excel. And as an analyst or someone who needs to model and explore and analyze that data, it introduces a lot of headaches when you try to actually analyze that data in a meaningful way. So ideally what you want is a rectangular table with distinct variables as columns and your observations as rows. So in this case, we're dealing with three things here. We're dealing with a dimension for year, and we're dealing with two quantitative fields or metrics, unit sales and total revenue. So ideally, we should end up with 3 columns: year, sales, and revenue, with 1 row for each observation. That's a properly formatted data set that we can effectively analyze once we put it into these BI and analytics tools. So to wrestle this table in its current format into the format we need, we're going to rely on our trusted friends Pivot and Unpivot. So first things first, we've got data organized horizontally, 1 column for each year, and we want these years to be rotated down into a vertical format so that there's 1 row per year per metric. Now to do that, you got to make sure you're selecting the right columns. If I just selected this first column and went into transform unpivot because I want to go from horizontal to vertical, it would give me something totally crazy and useless. So by default, Excel doesn't know that you want to unpivot a certain set of columns. So you have to manually select the ones. In this case, my 5 columns each represents 1 year, and these years are the ones that I want to translate from columns into rows. So I'll select those. You can see it created a new column to house those year values, and I've got 2 instances of each year, 1 for each metric. So that step was a good start for us, but we're not quite there yet. And let me just show you one other thing quickly. So I had selected all 5 of these columns. Another approach is to select the one that you don't want to pivot and use the unpivot other option. That does the exact same thing. So we're almost there, but remember we said we wanted 3 columns, 1 for year, 1 for sales, and 1 for revenue. So we're not quite there yet, and to get there, we want to take this first column, which has our metrics organized in a row format, and we want to bump that up to a horizontal format so that we've got a column for sales and a column for revenue. So we'll just do kind of the opposite of what we did, and we'll pivot this time, and we'll tell Excel our values live in the value column. And there you go. So now we've got a unique row for each year. We've got a unique column for the sales and a unique column for revenue. And if we just name that column year, we are officially good to go. So this is a properly formatted table that we can now use for any sort of analysis we need. So pretty cool, pretty helpful tool there. Before we go, I want to show you one other approach, and I'm going to take us all the way back to the source. So right here. And because we don't have duplicate values for either years or metrics here, transpose will do the trick as well. It works in a very, very similar way. But like I said, it just basically flips a whole data set or table onto its side. So what we can do here is, without even doing anything, without even promoting headers, I'm going to grab everything in this whole table and just hit transpose right here in the transform tab. And that gets us pretty close. Now, once we've transposed, now we can go ahead and use that first row as our headers. We can name this one year. And looks like we need to format these. So whole number for sales and currency for revenue. And there you go. You got to the same spot at the end of the day using both pivot, unpivot, and transpose. So hopefully that helps clear things up. I'm going to close out of here and discard. I don't want to actually load this fake data set. And there you have it. Pivot, unpivot, pretty useful tools when you need to transform a data set into a different structure.